Okay, so the last speaker today is Professor Geoffrey from MIT, and he's going to be talking about temperatures and skyrmions.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to this conference. I recovered from the hot study very last night. So I'm going to talk about work that's been largely in collaboration with several groups. Imaging room temperature skyrmions using various forms of X-ray microscopy. So this work has been done in collaboration with the TS Cloud, Peter Fisher, and more recently Stefan Eisbeck. And so I'm going to describe infill materials where the interfaces are driving the ion system, driving the negative experiments. I'm going to talk about some statics, fluid-driven dynamics, and nucleation experiments, and finally some theory for phase diagrams of these structures. So I only have one introductory slide, and I really don't need any, but we're all here because we like skyrmions and find them to be interesting. Skyrmions are topological particle-like objects. They have interesting interactions with one another, form things like lattices, melting-increasing transitions and stuff. They have interesting interactions with charge currents. So charge currents can drag skyrmions in some materials. Current-driven motion can happen at very low current densities. Those interactions go two ways. The texture itself can influence charge currents. So the spin polarized electrons pass through a topological texture. Very phase effects can act like fictitious magnetic fields. So these are very interesting interactions. And if one can harness some of these properties in room temperature materials, then one can make devices where skyrmions act as bits, and the spacing between these bits can encode data for multi-bit per cell memories, like racetrack memories, but potentially better because they are less susceptible to defects. They're topologically stable and other things that are really stated in the literature, although I want to describe a few of those concepts in a little bit more detail based on some of our experiments. And then finally, we've seen two different classes of materials, bulk and interface materials. My talk will focus on interface materials, where the broken inversion symmetry and spinor coupling can give rise to a strong BMI and generate skyrmions at these interfaces. And these interfaces are useful for driving skyrmions because of the large spin Hall effect. In heavy metals like platinum, it's a very efficient way to transform charge current into spin current and drive skyrmions very efficiently in these kinds of structures. So if we can create these kinds of structures and create skyrmions in them at room temperature, then we could potentially utilize them. So the structures that all of our work focuses on is multi-layer systems that are built on an individual stack structure that has a broken inversion symmetry built in. So we have material A, material B, material C. So that gives us broken inversion structure. We have energies that derive from the interfaces in the bulk. And one nice thing about thin films, and Axel emphasized this previously, is because all of these energies play a role in the formation and stability and dynamics of skyrmions in thin film materials. We can vary all of these interfaces in varying materials and therefore vary the energetics in a very nice and intelligible way. And in fact, the exchange interaction in anisotropy, uniform anisotropy for a uniform texture. Those fight again with magnetostatic effects, MS wants a non-uniform texture, and Maria wants a non-uniform texture. These energies appear in both interfaces in bulk. But by taking this stack structure of material A, material B, material C, and creating a superlattice type structure, we can vary these energies in a more powerful way, because it turns out that at least if the layers are quite thin, one can treat this material as a composite uniform material with effective material parameters. So the interface energy averaged over the volume scales as the number of interfaces. The magnetostatic energies scale in a more complicated way because that's a bulk energy. So for example, one can change the number of interfaces without changing the volume fraction of magnetic material and change the interfacial energies without changing the bulk magnetostatic energy. So there are a lot of ways that one can tune these material parameters just by choosing three materials and varying the relative thicknesses of them. But the way that these energies interact in forming magnetic skyrmions is quite complex. Because in general, in the multi-layer structure of finite thickness, all of these energy terms are there and they're important. They cannot be neglected. They enter, so one can't say, and I'll describe later, that simply increasing MS has some effect on the skyrmion, decreasing MS has another effect on the skyrmion, because the energy, they enter in magnetostatics, but also the domain energy, and they enter in relatively complicated ways. they enter in the effective anisotropy and such. But one can take advantage of this, say, vary the materials, vary the dimensionality, and control the spin texture, and control the length scale. One knows this going back many years. But just by controlling, say, a platinum thickness and the platinum multilayer, one can control the length scale of the spin textures, whether they're a stripe phase or a skyrmion-like phase. But by putting DMI into this system, one can reflect heterostructures and manipulate. So there are a lot of parameters in multilayer systems. One can engineer these in a relatively independent fashion. And so this makes multi-layer materials quite beneficial for designing skyrmions. It also gives us a problem because we have 4 material parameters. And varying all of these material parameters across thickness over this very wide space then becomes a very big problem, because if you're trying to engineer materials, you can't make all of these, and you can't magnetically simulate over this 5-dimensional space. So I'll come back to that at the end of my talk as well. But for now, multi-layers, we like them because we do a lot of things with them. So when we first began looking at magnetic skyrmions, we looked at structures based on our earlier discovery that there's a very large DMI at polycrystalline platinum and cobalt interfaces. And so we built up stack structures, in this case, of platinum, cobalt, and tantalum, where the platinum interface gives a strong DMI, the tantalum interface gives a very weak DMI. So in this inversion asymmetric structure, we have a very large net DMI. And they're both spin Hall metals with opposite spin Hall angle. So when we pass a current, spin currents are injected from both of these layers, so the spin Hall effect can be increased substantially. And we looked at this independently and found that the effective spin Hall angle through the actions of both of these layers goes up from about 7% for pure platinum to about 34% in this composite kind of structure. So then we began to build up multi-layers of these structures and examine the spin textures that arise using X-ray microscopy. So in these experiments, I'll talk about scanning in light field imaging using transmission X-ray microscopy. The sample is on a silicon nitride membrane, X-rays pass through, and using the polarization analysis of these, we can be sensitive to the texture. And so in these structures, if we begin, so this is a wire with contacts at either end, we can use a magnetic field to look at, in this case, the magnetic kind of a phase. In fact, by examining the length scale of the texture in this case, we can determine the effective domain hole energy. And by measuring the anisotropy and MS, we can determine the DMI. So simply examining the static structures is a powerful way to extract the material parameters. But then we can begin to manipulate things. So when we take this structure and we looked at things like finite size constraint that we saw in the previous talk and several other talks today, we found that in this case, in a planar disk, we can have a stripe-like pilot phase, and we can drive transitions between this phase and an ordered skyrmion lattice. And in fact, this was the first observation of an ordered skyrmion lattice at room temperature and also in zero magnetic field. We find that the confinement of the edge of this disk will hold this lattice in place. And so, in contrast to the skyrmion lattices that we've seen through most of the talks, which are located at relatively low temperatures and large magnetic fields, this was the first indication that we can have all of these effects at room temperature and materials that we can vary and potentially integrate into devices. And the skyrmion size can be manipulated by controlling the material parameters. So we can drive the system so that instead of having many skyrmions in a disk, we can have one. If we apply a magnetic field to squeeze the size of the skyrmion smaller and smaller, then we can bring it down to a case until it dies, until it pops. And we can look at the size and the size scaling as a function of magnetic field. And in these materials, we can drive skyrmions down to a size of about 50 nanometers. And so this size for these room temperature skyrmions is comparable to the skyrmions that have been reported in other materials. So we can make stable skyrmions at room temperature. We can engineer their size. We can have quite small skyrmions. And now I'm going to talk about their manipulation by electric current. So shortly after we made the experiments that I just showed you, we patterned these into tracks to try to look at the current driven dynamics. And we were very pleased to find very early on in the experiments that simply by cycling the magnetic field, we could create arrays of skyrmions in this track, and we could use the electrical current to drive these skyrmions back and forth. So we had the first operating skyrmion racetrack, but the thing that caused us a problem and some concern, and the thing that caused concern for viewers as well, is everybody knows that skyrmions are topologically protected and they don't interact with defects. But here we found skyrmions do interact with defects. Some of them move, some of them stay in position. And in fact, a current-driven pulse can annihilate a skyrmion that's at the defect. So topological protection doesn't seem to imply protection in terms of energetics, which is really what drives magnetism. If you look at a lot of the simulations and the assertions that skyrmions don't interact with defects, it's all a matter of length scale. If you have a skyrmion that's small compared to the length scale of disorder, then yes, skyrmions can wander around that disorder. But in a sputtered polycrystalline film, disorder will exist down to the atomic length scale. And if material parameters vary as a function of position, then any magnetic texture, whose energy depends on the local material parameters, will also vary with position. So any size spin texture we should expect to find in the crystalline film ought to experience pinning just like a magnetic uniform, and certainly it does. That wasn't a good enough for the reviewers, so we had to fix the problem. Now, not only do skyrmions become pinned, but we found, at least in these crystalline materials, that current pulses couldn't move them as fast as we want, but it also annihilates them whenever they become pinned. So some of the skyrmions can be driven at a few tens of meters per second, but most of them, as we cycle back and forth, vanish. But we found, fortunately, that if we went from a crystalline material cobalt to platinum, cobalt, boron, and GO, where the pinning for domain holes is known to be much lower due to the amorphous structure as opposed to having pinning boundaries, we could drive skyrmions back and forth repeatedly many times, and we could achieve very high velocities, exceeding 100 meters per second. And in these materials, because pinning is so low, we can do time resolve measurements. So we were able to look at the skyrmion Hall effect, as you saw Axel describe as well. Here we are in the dynamical regime. We're very far out of the freak regime, using skyrmions that are interacting very, very weakly with defects. So this is a time-resolved experiment where we're putting a nanosecond pulse to drive a skyrmion one way and then back, and repeating this billions of times, and timing this with an X-ray flash to build up into a movie. Now, you wouldn't see skyrmions at all if they were pinned, because you have to have complete repeatability every time you ship a skyrmion back and forth to see the contrast survive over all these cycles. So we know that the interactions with defects are very small in this material, and nonetheless, we find a very large skyrmion Hall angle. But what we find, just like Axel has found, the skyrmion Hall angle varies as a function of velocity up to very high velocities, because it's not something you would expect from a rigid skyrmion model. So tomorrow, Matthias Bauer will describe a lot more in the dynamics, but I want to move on now to try to do some nucleation. So we found and engineered materials in which we can make racetracks, we can make small skyrmions, we can make fast skyrmions. If you want a working device, you also need to be able to read skyrmions and write them. So I want to talk about the writing mechanism. And because we're using a system that has a large spin Hall effect, if we can use the spin currents ejected from this heavy metal in a local fashion to inject spins or somehow manipulate the magnetization, we may have a mechanism where we can write skyrmions using in-plane currents, and I'm going to show you that we can do exactly that. So I first want to show some simulations that describe the mechanism, and then I'll show experiments that show you that it works. So in these simulations, we've taken a magnetic track, and we've put in a defect. Here we've just locally buried the magnetic anisotropy. We've weakened the anisotropy at a point. And now I'm going to do simulations where we flow the current through the structure, just a uniform current. And when we apply the current pulse, you can see that a skyrmion is created right where that defect is. And if we reduce the amplitude below the threshold to nucleate a skyrmion, then we can ship the skyrmion. So simply by putting a defect in the film, we can see in micromagnetics that we can create an array of ones and zeros for a skyrmion kind of device. And we can do it in a very controllable fashion with an in-plane current using the chain current path that one would use to ship the magnetic skyrmion, just taking advantage of the different threshold currents to do a write operation versus a shift operation. And so we can write arbitrated sequences in this way. Now, the way the mechanism works is really quite interesting. It makes use of the Zalshinsky-Maria interaction in quite a nice way. So all of you are quite likely familiar with spin orbit torque switching. If you just have a platinum cobalt film and you apply an in-plane current, you can switch the magnetization from up to down. But you can only do it if you apply an in-plane field to tilt the magnetization, because you have to break a symmetry. It has to do with the symmetries of the spin orbit torque. So whenever you see one of these spin Hall switching effects, they always specify the in-plane bias field to allow you to switch from that state. And without that bias field, nothing happens. You can't go from the up state to the down state. Here, we're using spin orbit torque switching to do exactly that with this localized defect. The reason it works is when you apply this in-plane current, the spin orbit torques will cause all the magnetization to tilt, to cant a little bit within this wire. If the material were uniform, then the canting would be uniform. But here, the anisotropy is a little bit weaker, so the canting is a little bit stronger in that region. And because the anisotropy has a gradient in it, then the canting has a gradient. But now, if you have a gradient in the magnetization, then the DMI gives you an effective field. That's where it exists. That's where it manifests. So the spin orbit torques cause the magnetization to cant a little bit, but there's a little bit of a twist that builds up because the anisotropy is not uniform. Now you've got an in-plane effective field from the DMI. Instead of an in-plane effective field, you would apply spin-over torque switching experiment. That allows the damping ring torque to switch the magnetization check here without any external field supply. And once that happens, then the object can grow, so one can nucleate it. We'll cut off a few here. But you nucleate an object, and you nucleate an object with some block points. And as it pulls away, that block point eventually flips around, and then you have a topological object. So right when you nucleate the domain, it still has a topological charge of 0, then that evolution takes place a little bit later. And so I want to show you that it works. Or at least it's consistent with experiments. So with these, we've been using X-ray holography. It's higher resolution than the standard techniques, and there's some other things that we're interested in. So we have a structure where there's a magnetic strip. The field of view is relatively small, it's 1 micron here. And we apply current pulses in this case. There are no in-plane fields. And what we find is that above a threshold, we can generate magnetic skyrmions, and we can do it in a very reproducible fashion. And we can do it very fast. So if we look at the threshold, this is the current density as a function of length of the pulse. We find a very clear boundary between the generation of no skyrmions and the generation of the skyrmion every time. So it's not a stochastic process in this case, but this boundary marks a boundary to deterministic generation of skyrmions. And we can do it very fast. At reasonable current density, we can get sub-nanosecond creation of individual skyrmions at a known location every time. We find that if we map where skyrmions are created, and we compare that to where skyrmions are pinned, we find a correlation between these. So the skyrmions are created always in the same place. This is a map of nucleation probability. And so these are due to natural defects. We didn't put them in, we didn't really want them there initially, but we're glad they ended up being there. And then we want to make devices where we actually create the defect. So we took the same thing and used the fib to create a notch in here. And that notch also acts like a defect because the magnetostatic energies are now varying as a function of position. So the spin-over torque, well, there's already going to be a magnetization twist. The spin-over torque will enhance that. And at corners, we can nucleate magnetic skyrmions and drive them away. So here's a current pulse in one case where we can create a skyrmion, and we can apply a current pulse in the other direction, create a skyrmion on the other side. We can annihilate a skyrmion at that point, and we can drive skyrmions away. And again, we can do this in repeatedly. So this is deterministic generation. But it requires defects. I want to go back now to thermal generation of magnetic skyrmions. Not generation, but a transition between strike phase and skyrmion phase that we've also observed in these materials. So we go back to this kind of multi-layer stack, the platinum, cold iron, boron, MgO, which is a very low-penning material. And we make another structure. I'm sorry, the scale is on here, but I think it's about 2 microns in size with current contacts. And the demagnetized state here is a labyrinth kind of a state. Now, we apply a sequence of current pulses. Here we're playing a pulse train that's bipolar. So we're essentially shaking the magnetization back and forth. And we find we can drive this state in a very repeatable manner into a stripe-like phase, an ordered stripe phase with the stripes are colored in the direction it's shown. In fact, we can drive the stripes to orient in either direction, but I won't go into those details. We do the same experiment with an applied magnetic field as opposed to zero field, and we find a transition to drive it to skyrmions. Now, this isn't nucleation of skyrmions out of nowhere, like I showed you before, but this is a transition from the magnetic texture here to this, or a transition from magnetic texture to this. So it's breaking up of the stripes into magnetic skyrmions. And we know that it's not due to pinning because here we're using one of these very low pinning stacks. And this is a case where we've partially driven the transition. We've got skyrmions and we've got some stripes remaining. And then we can use uniform current pulses to drive them back and forth. And we find no evidence of pinning and no correlation between pinning sites and where these skyrmions appear. So it appears to be a different kind of a mechanism. So when we look at that mechanism, we see that there is a threshold. So here I'm plotting, this is the initial state, and for the same length of a current pulse, this is the voltage, but this is the proportion of the current density in the structure. There's a threshold here between 1.7 volts and 1.8 volts to drive this into this. So there's a very clear demarcation for this. But that threshold is not intrinsic. Now, if it were spin-over torque that had any role in this, then that should be intrinsic. You expect some small thermal effects, but nothing significant. So what is the threshold current related to? Well, if we do the same experiment, but in this case, we change the length of the pulse and simultaneously change the amplitude of the pulse, so the thermal energy, or the joule heating is the same, then we see that we can go well below what this threshold seems to be, 1.8 volts, increase the time of this current pulse, and we can get to exactly the same state with a much lower threshold. So this doesn't seem to be as a spin torque kind of a threshold, but something that's thermal. And so the transition is related to the threshold power. There's a similar paper in LANL-SkyrmionWorkshop that came to a very similar conclusion by these kinds of experiments. We can, if we look at this transition, it's not an instantaneous effect, it's a cumulative effect. So if we apply only one pulse, then we don't do much at all. If we apply 10 pulses, then we start to see some of these stripes breaking into skyrmions, and this is a progressive operation. And it's temperature dependent. If we go instead of room temperature to an elevated temperature, then we find we need fewer pulses to do the same job. And if we go instead to a lower temperature, then even after 10,000 pulses, we barely create any skyrmions at all. So it's related to temperature, it's related to the number of pulses, it's related to the length of the pulses. And in fact, the reason it's happening over many, many pulses is there's a cumulative heating that's going on in the system, which we can calculate by measuring that. So there seems to be a transition temperature to drive the system from one phase to another, and that transition temperature depends on the magnetic field. And so when we look at this, to look at something that's beginning to approach a phase diagram, at substrate temperature, the amplitude of the current density that is used in the magnetic field, then we find for zero magnetic field, we drive a transition at large enough voltage or high enough temperature into a stripe-like phase. We go higher and higher in magnetic field, then we go into a skyrmion phase, and the ease with which this happens increases as the temperature increases. And we understand this in terms of the energetics. So if one does micromagnetics and finds for the possible phases, skyrmion lattice stripes and the labyrinth kind of structures, as a function of magnetic field, the lowest energy configuration changes at the lowest, at zero magnetic field and low field, the stripe phase is the lowest energy. As you go up above the transition, when the transition is going to last phase becomes lower energy. That's exactly what we find experimentally. And then we can use this to really dynamically control the spin temperature. So if we start at a labyrinth kind of a phase and apply a current pulse in a magnetic field, we can create skyrmions. Then we can go back to zero magnetic field, and skyrmions remain stable. So we can drive it into now metastable state to drive the skyrmions stability. Then we can manipulate these skyrmions. So after we created these zero-field stable skyrmions, we can drive them back and forth. And if we go back to zero magnetic field and drive these bipolar pulses to heat it, we can drive the skyrmions back into a straight phase. So we can go from one phase to the other by tuning the temperature to the magnetic field. So let me jump through this. So the last, I want to show a few slides returning to this idea. With multi-layers, changing the thickness and interface materials, we can control all of these parameters and access and really understand the relation between material parameters and skyrmion structure and energetics. But then that presents a problem because we've got 4 material parameters plus thickness and magnetic field. It's a 6-parameter space that analytically is impossible to calculate because of the magnetostatic angle, which can be solved in various limits, in the ultra-thin limit, film limit, and the ultra-thick film limit. But at intermediate film thicknesses, it's typically neglected or treated in a very simplistic way. And micromagnetically, clearly with this kind of parameter space, it's really not attractive to do that either in simulations or in experiments. And so what we asked ourselves, can we analytically solve for a skyrmion structure as a function of all of these material parameters without making assumptions about, say, neglecting straight field energy and things of this nature, and to try to understand the phase diagram in a tractable and an analytic way. And so I say we, but this is really done with my postdoc, Felix Woodner. So when he arrived a couple of years ago, I said, let's just use Amazon Cloud, and we get 1,000 servers and calculate everything. And I thought this was a great idea, and then he started, he said, I need to have some starting points. So he started to try to use some of the old bubble models, and he found those to be inadequate. And he was working on that, and after about a year of me pushing him, we realized we don't need the micromagnetics anymore. What he did was take all of these integrals, including integrals that have been out for about 40 years and never solved, the magnetostatic integral, the 6-fold integral that's non-local, and he plotted the solution in different regimes, and he stared at it, and he just eyeballed analytic functions that could parameterize that, and then showed that for every energy term, he could find easily calculable analytic solutions that span the entire region of parameter space to a less than 1% error. I told him 2% would be fine, but he went 3 more months to get it down to 1%. So now all of these energy terms we can do the full phase diagram skyrmions and see a lot of things. What he used was a very nice nonsense and experimentally shown approximation that can capture and describe the skyrmion structure in terms of its radius, in terms of an effective domain hole width, and a domain hole angle, so whether it's block and nail. And so these parameters feed back into one another. But he found a way to calculate the energy then of a skyrmion as a function of these to minimize them to find the structure, find the equilibrium radius, domain hole width, and domain hole angle. And then to do this as a function of any parameter in the material. So we can go from a magnetic simulation that would take 10 hours to about 100 microseconds to calculate the equilibrium state in any case. And so I want to just describe a few examples that come out of this. So first, I couldn't follow all the math, so I told him to do micromagnetics to prove to me that it works. He's done all kinds of cases with his analytic model, with brute force integration of the integrals, and with his model with micromagnetics, and they all agree in a beautiful way. And gives us very useful information not only in the static structure, but the energetics. You calculate micromagnetics, you find only the lowest energy configuration. But you don't really see what the energy landscape is. What is the energy as a function of radius? So you don't know things about energetic stability, energy barriers, stiffness of skyrmions, etc. But by virtue of having this model and understanding all of the energy terms, one can pull out the whole energy landscape and get a lot more insight into skyrmions. So for example, one can calculate the energy as a function of radius to find the equilibrium in skyrmion size, but then break that down into energies like negative static energy and DMI energy, and find which is responsible for the stability of the skyrmion. So when people use in papers, magnetostatically stabilized versus DMI stabilized, this is a way to quantify that. One can see by the slope of one energy term versus the other, which is responsible for the stability of the skyrmion. In fact, most skyrmions people study mathematically would be magnetostatically stabilized, despite the fact that DMI is large. And also things like topological projection. They turn out not to play any role in terms of stability. Everything is driven by energetics. The zero field size of the skyrmion, so the energy to nucleate, has nothing to do with chirality or DMI or anything else. It's a universal value that's about 27 times the exchange constant times the thickness. The depth of this potential well with respect to that is a function of all material parameters. And that allows the tuning of the energetics of the skyrmion, but it's not an easy thing to do unless your fields and have all of these models. And so one can ask questions. So for example, it becomes useful when you're trying to apply the referee reports about this very wonderful question that always comes up. So bubbles versus skyrmions. Bubbles are thought to be large and only stabilized by magnetostatics. And the only way you can get something small is with BMI. And so that gives two classifications of objects that are qualitatively different from one another. And this is stated all over the place. I don't want to pick out any particular papers, but there are statements that these kinds of objects, again, what I'm plotting here is the spin rotation angle is a function of radius. So it's very, very sharp for a skyrmion, and then you've got a plateau for a bubble, because it's a narrow domain wall of a large structure. These are, DMI is required to stabilize these kinds of things, and this is fundamentally different from this. And for D equals 0, only bubble domains are available, and you have to have a DMI to have something like that looks like this. And so this is a question. It's also an important question because it really drives a lot of research. So skyrmions sometimes are identified just on the basis of their size, because it's believed that small objects can only be driven in systems where there's a very large DMI. So one can ask that question. With this model, one can just search through with D equals 0. What's the smallest size skyrmion can you get? And is that a reasonable material? So everything I'm showing you, these calculations are for reasonable materials that can be experimentally achieved with cobalt or like this. And so here are two skyrmions, a radius versus field, in the case of no BMI, in the case with BMI. And one can see that the size, the terminal size of these two skyrmions is very, very similar. So you can get very, very small skyrmions. And in fact, if you go back to this schematic that tells us what a skyrmion is versus a bubble, well, this is this magnetostatic skyrmion. DMI equals 0. This is something that could be achieved in a cobalt-based film. And if you plot the radius, or the angle is a function of radius, and matches just on this. So if you saw that, you call that the skyrmion, and then you'd be surprised to see there's no BMI. In fact, one can continuously tune this thing to this thing, just by applying a magnetic field or by tuning material parameters continuously. So this is a very sharp core object, and just changing the ratio of anisotropy to DMI, you can continuously go to something like this. So I think mathematically, it's much more difficult to distinguish between what is a skyrmion and what is a bubble in any kind of a reasonable way. With this model, we can really examine the effects of all parameters. I won't go through all of this, but you can look at radius, whether it's block or AL, something I call multi-stability, as a function of all material parameters. So this is about 1 million different material combinations calculated in an active room. You never do that with micromagnetics, but it tells us what's possible in skyrmions. And allows us to discover things that we may not have expected. So for example, the energy as a function of radius is not always just parabolic. And one can have several energy minima. So this is a material where the energy versus radius has 2 minima. One that stabilizes large block skyrmions and one that stabilizes very small nail skyrmions. Same material and under the same material and same magnetic field, both of these can be stable and they can coexist. They have very different statics and dynamics and interactions with one another. But there are regions of the phase space where one can find this. One can find not just 2 minima, but many minima. So this is a case where the radius as a function of position is not quadratic at all. There are many minima, and they are spaced so closely together compared to KT that we would call this, or we call this a zero stiffness skyrmion. There's essentially no restoring force for very large changes in the radius of this skyrmion, because the energy versus radius is not parabolic. And we can identify if we want skyrmions that are stable at zero field. We can look at that as a function of, say, DMI and Q. But what's important for all of this design is not just size of skyrmion and other things, but also the energy barriers, whether they are stable. And we can make an estimate of that stability barrier as a function of all of these material parameters as well. So there are other parameters embedded in here, but in this structure it tells us within this pocket of DMI and Q, quality factor, we can get zero field stable skyrmions of various sizes. But if we look at whether they will be stable or not, they all have a stability barrier that's less than 40 kT, so they may not be useful for this particular set of materials. But we can then identify and find other materials in which it's useful. If one looks at, for other parameters that are embedded in here, one can look as a function of mass and wheeling. We saw our Fullerton say earlier that we want these to be small. I think everyone knows this now. We can make, so the color coding here, especially anyone who's been troubling over the star thing, will be less than 10 nanometers. So this model becomes helpful to figure out whether and how that can be done. And without showing you all of the parameters, color scaling below green is what you want if you're trying to do this. You have to make MS smaller, but you actually want KU to be relatively large. But is it stable at room temperature? You can do all of these things, and that's great. But if you look at the stability barrier as a function of the same parameters, blue is bad, orange is good. So the thermally stable skyrmions are the large ones. The skyrmions that are not stable at room temperature are the small ones that you want. So it's not so easy to do. And in fact, with cobalt-based films, where the MS is quite high, no matter what you do, you never solve the task. But there are ways to do it. So we've identified materials and phase pockets where fields can now put some boundary conditions. Let's say varying all the material parameters over reasonable ranges. We want only those objects that are greater than 50 kT stability. Well, you can go and do that, and we can make very pretty plots of this. And so as a function of D and exchange and other parameters that are embedded in here, again, I'm not going to tell you. We can identify where and how to do that. And since we're experimentalists, we want to see that it works. So this motivates us to look at very particular materials. We've looked at those recently, and we've identified a material X, where X-ray holography seems to indicate that 10 nanometer skyrmions can exist at room temperature. So this can really inform the design of materials in an analytic way, almost a brute force inverse design problem of materials. So with that, it's more or less all that I have to say. We can make skyrmions, we can manipulate the energies, we can make them move fast, and we can calculate all of these properties. But I also want to point out that there are a lot of things that we say about skyrmions that are a little bit misleading, that have to do with their topological character. Topology is interesting and beautiful and mathematically elegant, but in terms of practical consequences, it may not be what we all hope. So small size, we don't need DMI for that. It has nothing to do with topology. Topology and size don't really have anything to do with these apparent use population. In fact, I haven't shown it here, but a 10 nanometer skyrmion is 10 times harder to drive than a 100 nanometer skyrmion, even in the absence of disorder. Sensitivity to defects and stability. Energy stability has nothing to do with topology in these systems, so that doesn't offer something. But DMI does give benefits. DMI allows them to be all homopyric. And a purely magnetostatic skyrmion would not be useful for current-driven devices because they're all going to have a random chirality. You apply current, one will move one way and one will move the other way. So it's useful for that reason. I didn't show it here, but if you want ultra small skyrmions down to a nanometer, you do need DMI, or down to less than around a nanometer, you do need DMI. And things like this current-induced nucleation, it relies on DMI for kind of a subtle reason to create these in-plane fields, but it's a very useful and important property to have in these standard materials. So the things that are useful, but they may not be the things that we're always telling proposal review boards. So with that, I'll conclude this probably over time talk.
So this case of no historic force, do you discuss the same structure or is it in terms of
In those, they are nailed. They're nailed throughout that regime. But since it's not a strictly strong function of size, then you wouldn't even necessarily expect it to be circular. And so this assumption is only for the circular domain, the one with an expected that would not even look circular. So it would have no need to be.
So the modeling's great. I'm just wondering, as films get thicker and Q, all your Q's are above 1. So if you go below Q equals 1 and thicker films, you get block walls in the middle and the L caps at the top. You start getting three-dimensional structures. And I mean, is it that good to get all these different kind of domain structures?
That's
wall structures?
That's absolutely true, and we've seen that in some cases, as you and others have. So this model assumes that things are uniform from Z.
Okay. That's fabulous.
So we're adding, right?
Okay.
That's probably another year of intervals.
Go get it.
You know, let's say, and this is a public field, so I had nothing to do with it. I didn't even want to do it. Really start over. But these integrals and analytic models for bubbles and things have been around in the 70s, and they've never been solved. Even in
You're going to put this online?
Huh?
Are you going to put this online?
We get it published? No, we will put, I mean, we put a manuscript describing the results online. We do not put supplemental information that has the solutions to the integrals.
Okay.
But we will be happy to do that and put nice MATLAB scripts and everything on there when we get to that point. Otherwise, no one's going to use it.
You said that there is no topological stability of the skyrmion. Can you elaborate what you mean?
What I mean is that the annihilation energy, so it has nothing to do with DMI. DMI doesn't appear. So whether you have a block structure or an AL structure, that doesn't give you stability. Both the nucleation and the annihilation barriers are finite even in a continuum model. So that's often what people are describing. If you have a continuum model, then you can't create it or destroy the skyrmion. You need to put it on a finite mesh or something like this. But the energy at zero radius is finite, and that's been known for some time. It depends only on the exchange constant A. And the energy barrier for annihilation depends on that 0 point energy, and it depends on the energy minimum. It depends on all of the material parameters. But it's simply an energy barrier.
But this is usually applied.
So they're all topologically protected. Everything I'm talking about here is topologically protected. Mathematically speaking. But that doesn't mean that the energy barrier is somehow larger. There's no way to add an additional parameter that is topology into the energetics to say that that somehow adds additional stability. The only things you have are A, K, and D, and MS.
because the dimensions in
Yeah, this is two-dimensional. And so the energy barriers we calculate will be an out bound because we're assuming the circular is symmetric. People have done calculations with the finite meshes and things, and that changes it by, so the unit here is A times D, and that 0 point energy is 27 AD, and those kinds of things will give a factor of about 2 or 3 AD. So when we're calling something stable, we add that in.
I mean, I also would like to refer to his statement that maybe the topological chart, the topological protection doesn't add anything to stability. I think there might be also a little bit of misleading thing. I mean, you know, I agree.